Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very specific event. The lecture by a dear colleague and friend, Manon Mollard, from Architecture Review in UK, London. The title of this talk, as you probably read on the posters and on the social media, it's Critical Thinking in Critical Times. We are very glad to welcome you here at the TU Wien. To somehow show our community the importance of different roles that we can hold within our discipline. And maybe in this moment that we are finally getting aware that we are in the critical times, that we need, that there is no, we cannot wait any longer. And we need to maybe rethink what is the purpose of our discipline, how to work, where to work, when to work. Therefore, it was important to give, to have another voice, a voice of an editor, a voice of a thinker, a voice of someone who is addressing the challenges which are urgent. And we will hopefully hear in your lecture the depth of which you try to address them through the Architectural Review magazine. Just a few notes. We've known each other for some time, but last year we were part of a very specific, let's say, journey. It was still pandemic. I was invited to join as a juror into Architectural Review House Award, which is a very important award that this particular magazine, which is one of the oldest architectural magazines, has been giving for many years. Fortunate enough, we had been recipients of that. That was also the reason. What was interesting about the discussions that we had from extremely diverse and very specific proposals, from luxury homes to very challenging spatial or material experiments, that at the end we gave the biggest award to a non-house. For me, that was like, that was kind of showing the shift in which you're willing to go. That we know that designing the most beautiful house, it's not something that we should be inspiring. So Nomos architects based in Geneva and in Madrid, they got the main award for transformation of a garage into a home, that it's equally in size of a house, but it's actually an apartment in the ground floor. So this was, I think, extremely crucial to somehow to see the potential of such an established magazine to still be able to go also within all the structures that you have in place to do this stretch. And I was really appreciating the discussions we had with you and also with other jurors. So I think a couple of important words that probably Manon is not going to speak about herself, but about the work that she's doing. So currently she's the editor of Architectural Review, but she's also a graduate of Architectural Association School of Architecture in London. In addition to writing and then editing the AR, she writes also for other publications, and she holds the position of a guest critic at many different schools and also many different institutions. You collaborated with Trienal de Lisboa, with RIBA, and with the Canadian Centre of Architecture, among others. I think it's what we are hoping, and you are going to give us a position of what's the role of a architectural publication today, how far and how deep it could address issues, because we know we are in this kind of turning point. Just to mention, of course, just to mention a position that it's written about architectural review. So coming at architecture from a slight, what's the agenda? Coming at architecture from a slight tangent, the filters of waste, education, animals, collage, or energy drive editorial choices and look at the bigger picture. And in order to somehow sum up or give you the stage, you somehow described that is this lecture leading to in order to search what is the purpose of publishing today. And like I'm quoting, it kindled an acute responsibility for magazines to document, to interrogate, to revisit. In its pages, the AR is less interested in the architect's intentions, which we think it's the most important, preferring instead to examine the wider forces that shape architecture, to understand why and how buildings are made, what impact they have on the world. And to conclude, it's the quote, "Buildings are constructed on site, but architecture is constructed in the discourse," and I hope we are going to contribute to discourse tonight. Thank you, Manon.
Thank you so much, Tina. Thanks, Tina, and thanks, Jakob, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I'm just going to try and get everything in the right order. Yes. So, I've chosen Critical Thinking for Critical Times as a title. I think it's difficult to argue we're not living in critical times. I'm sure we will discuss them, and I hope there'll be time for a question, conversation. And I'm going to focus more on the critical thinking aspect, on what it is and how it manifests itself in an architectural publication. So I've got 3 chapters for you for tonight, and we'll start with the first one, which is Makoko. So I wanted to start by going back to the summer of 2013. At the time, I was an intern at the Architectural Review, and during the month of August, we sent our September issue to press. So this is the cover of it. And in this issue, we proudly published the Makoko Floating School. So it was a cover story, named so because it features on the cover. It spoke about empowerment. It was a carrier of hope. The opener of the piece was a signature E1 band shot taken from the air. Mist in the sky, double-page spread. There was an extensive reportage inside the magazine that portrayed the life of this small triangular structure in what is known, and I say this in quote marks because it's not a word we like very much, but in the floating slum of Lagos in Nigeria. There they are, smiling children wearing their uniforms. There were atmospheric shots of the surrounding. There were fishermen disentangling their nets on the lower level of the school building. And so it was a brilliant project, and it was chosen for the cover because it proved, really, or it seemed to prove, that innovative architecture could address the elemental needs of a deprived community. It seemed to promise that it would catalyze change for the future, both in Lagos and beyond. But 3 years later, there was a so-called improved, prefabricated, and industrialized iteration that was docked in the Arsenale, some of you might remember, during the Venice Biennale. And the project won the Silver Lion for being an iconic and pragmatic piece of architecture. So this is a picture of it in the Arsenale, as you might recognize. And a week again or so later, there was a storm that hit Lagos, and the original A-frame timber structure that was floating in the lagoon was destroyed. So all that was left of this very celebrated, very photogenic school were some scattered blue plastic barrels and a flattened pile of planks adrift in murky lagoon waters. And from slightly further. So a day after the news of the collapse, which was published on a Nigerian news website, NAIJ at the time, the practice who designed the school, NLA, sent a press release. And this press release claimed that after 3 years of, and I quote, intensive use, exceptional service to the community, the floating school comes down for upgrade. The press release also insisted on the structure's decommission and its pending reconstruction. They included some photographs as kind of proof of the pending reconstruction. So we have here a very different lagoon to Makoko, Venice. The image is, I guess, just as atmospheric as those barn shots. So beyond the fact that it was hard to believe that the storm was part of an upgrade plan, the school's destruction made clear that the building was not actually being used by the community in a good way, because no one was actually hurt when it was destroyed. But we found out about the storm through a writer that was kind of in Lagos and found out about it because it was only kind of spread in very local news. And it's the kind of thing, as a magazine based in London, we kind of rely a lot on contributors, writers, photographers, architects, filmmakers around the world to also talk about what is happening around them. And so we published a kind of an online story. It was Thomas Berlanda. And in this piece, Thomas wrote, "You are left wondering how much of the use of the building as a school was staged." It then took another 2 years for a journalist, Aline Geistel, to carry out an investigation, which was much more of a kind of a piece of investigative journalism, where she could unpeel the layers of the story, the characters, the conversations, and she accurately described this all as a parable of complicity. And so her account was published in 2018 on the Atavist. So we're now kind of 5 years plus after it was featured in kind of the international press as such. And Aline Geistel's chronicle deconstructs the upward spiral of events that built Makoko's reputation, or the floating school's reputation, and she exposed what she referred to as the myths that people want to believe about the world. So her devastating account revealed that the floating A-frame structure barely had time to become a school. The blackboard and the toilets had never been installed. There were questions of ego, of money, of power that were intertwined with tangled narratives of architecture as a tool of social betterment. But in the end, the school remains as just an image, as a kind of fleeting symbol floating in the distance. So in a dark twist of events, the AR's 2013 headline, Learning from Lagos, remained, and I think still remains, prophetic. Yet the lessons learned could not be more different than what we kind of intended when we wrote and printed this headline. The point at which an architect hands over a project is a source of controversy in this instance. And even though the architect eventually relinquishes responsibility because other people take over to kind of run the school, look after it, maintain it, etc., we feel at the AR that it is one of the duties of the architectural media to follow up and to investigate and to report on the life of a building in use, its tales of maintenance and upkeep, its evolution and impact. Hence why the intentions are only the very beginning of the story. Because if we don't do that, if we don't understand and test buildings once they've materialized in the real world and when they're actually used, the project descriptions, the narrative that would circulate in the press would just be a mere kind of echo of the architect's intent. And I'm not, holding necessarily architects to account here. I don't think it's their job to do that. I'm really talking here about the point at which the building is kind of handed over. Because, and it's important to say that the intentions of Kunle Adeyemi, who's the founder of NLA, and his practice, NLA, as well as the ambitions of the floating school, they remained and they still remain laudable. There was also kind of quite a large accompanying body of research studying flood-prone African coasts, and all that remains valid. Yet, this particular project, in my eyes, remains one of the most recent instances where the architectural press admittedly played a crucial and complicit role in elevating a story to a point of no return. It's also then one that left a mark on me because at the time I had been at the AR for a month, I think. And seeing the story unfold over the years has also shaped, I think, how we make choices, editorial choices about the buildings we publish, the kind of stories we want to tell today in the magazine's pages. One of the quite simple but obvious move is that we want to make sure we visit. We often commission new photography, and I'll get to that a bit later. So now that I've shared this kind of first anecdote, I want to go back even further in time, because the AR is 126 years old as a publication. We're saying one of the oldest. I think there might be one that is older, maybe in the States, but I'll find out. So I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the AR itself and to go back to the very beginning. So this is the very first cover of the AR, which was published in November 1896, when the magazine's full title was The Architectural Review for the Artist and Craftsman. And the early issues of the AR were very broad in scope, and they were designed to make architectural criticism visual as well as verbal. It was always a publication that relied very heavily on drawings, on images. And the AR also, I think, as even the kind of full title reveals, was always about more than architecture. It's also about commentary, it's also about criticism, it's also about culture, it's also about boats and canals, It's also about fairground rides. It's about pubs, which are very important in the UK in particular. Indoor plants, this was a whole issue in the 50s about indoor plants. It's also about food, the architecture of desserts. It's about uncoated paper, different stocks. It's about die cuts. It's about the seaside. This spread in particular is from the July 1936 issue, which was guest edited by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. I think I'm pronouncing this wrong, so apologies. But so all the photographs on the left of the spread were taken by him, for example. And the reason all these things that are not or don't seem to appear to be architecture are important is that they influence, and I think in turn they are influenced by architecture. And at the IR we're interested both in the wider forces that shape architecture, why and how a building comes to be made, as well as the impact that architecture has on the world once it is built and in use. And that is the world of politics, the world of economics, it's also society, it's the ecology. So it's a world that clearly goes beyond the world of architects. One important thing that hasn't changed since 1896 is that the AR has never been a business tool as such, when a lot of architectural press is more directed at the kind of the professional body. And I think it's partly because this magazine has always been very international in outlook, and has been since the beginning the kind of sister title of another publication, which is called the Architects Journal. And so when they were founded, the AJ, the Architects Journal, was founded a year earlier, so in 1895. And the AJ was very much a weekly, news-focused publication that kind of spoke about and to UK architects or buildings in the UK. And so the AR was founded a year later, and so they've remained as kind of companions, and the idea being that they're complementary. And so, in the words of its first editor, who was Henry Wilson, the AR is the only magazine in the British Empire dealing with the artistic as distinguished from the business side of architecture. We won't dwell on the British Empire part of the quote, but I think it's this idea of the artistic side of architecture is much broader, and I think some of the covers and some of the spreads from the archive that I was sharing with you was also to give you a sense of the types of topics that they were interested in or dedicating pieces or entire issues to. So it is a very broad definition of architecture. And this is something that very much remains true today, even if it makes it very difficult for the owners, the current owners of the magazine, to understand what this thing is and how to market it and how to make money. But that's maybe a conversation for another day or for later on. So the AR, as I was saying, doesn't actually cover news. The online story for the Makoko floating school was actually a bit of an exception. And instead, it's about what we call evergreen content. So the idea is that the magazine is commissioned and edited in such a way that readers will refer to it for years to come. This is a photograph of a retired now architect called Alistair Ruth, who called us when he had to move house and didn't know what to do about his lifelong collection of ARs. And so we ended up packing them up and getting them, because we don't necessarily have single issues of our full archive. We often have a lot of bound volumes, which can make it much more difficult to scan or to use some of that content. And also a huge shame is that when they were binding the magazines into volumes of like 6 months or 12 months worth of issues, they would remove the covers, because that's how they would kind of strip the cover away, remove the glue from the spine to be able to bind them, and the covers are brilliant. So it's always great to have single issues, and so we said we would happy to help him and empty his house before he moved, and so we just thought it would be nice to take a photograph. So he's looking at the Outrage issue, which is another kind of particularly important one. So as I was saying, what we publish doesn't expire. It's the idea, we'd like to think that it remains relevant anyway, and which is why they can be kept. So what we look at, because I've said a lot about what we don't do, like news, but what we do look at is what happens when the buildings are inhabited, when political systems change, when the power balances shift, when buildings are poorly maintained, or when they're demolished, when trends come and go. Looking back at the history and the archive of the AR, it's just as fascinating to look at what has been published and what wasn't published. And it's often a matter of kind of personal taste. You had an editor who was very into high tech and didn't like postmodernism at all, so you have kind of a lot of important names completely missing from the AR's history of architecture. So obviously personal taste does play a role, and looking at what has been and who has been kind of omitted from the pages, and which regions of the world have been kind of received more attention and which haven't, is quite interesting. There is a kind of, maybe it's something we'll do where we'll do the issue number 1500 next spring, and one idea is to look at this idea of archive and looking at what wasn't there rather than what is there. So the AR, we say today that it's about fearless storytelling, about independent critical voices, and about thought-provoking projects from around the world, which I think is not new. I think that, again, remains true from issues from the archive. And there's always a lot to learn from what's happening elsewhere, especially when the world seems to be closing in on itself. This is a slightly more recent issue, which was about books and buildings for books, about libraries, where we argued that architecture was built through the discourse as well as much through buildings. And I wanted to use it to kind of look at the idea of what publishing is and what ideas can be conveyed through publication. So to publish comes from the Latin publicus, publicare, and it means to make publicly known, to reveal, to announce, to divulge. And so for most of their existence, the main purpose of the Architectural Review, as well as several other journals of record, was to present recently completed buildings from around the world, often previously unseen and always deemed significant. And recently, about a decade or so ago, there's been a shift in the ways building studies in particular are written in the AR and the filters that we use to determine the projects that get published. Sorry. We all know that images of new buildings are shown and shared online. They're traveling fast and far on screens. And so for a print publication, publishing what is new no longer holds the same relevance. Novelty belongs online, and that's not just the idea of writing about news, but also just showing a building because it's new and that's why it's in the magazine starts to lose a bit of relevance, because as a print publication distributed internationally, it's always going to be late. It's never going to be the first to show. So we have to come up with alternative filters and criteria to guide the selection and not rely on novelty. And in order to kind of adjust and revisit the agenda, I think there's also been a realization, particularly from editors and particularly for print publications, and certainly for the AR, that there is a kind of that accrued responsibility for magazines to document, to interrogate, and to revisit. So to go deeper and sometimes to publish things that are older rather than newer, because actually there is more to learn. And we know that architecture is slow, and to understand the impact and to learn the lessons from a particular project can take some time. The accompanying text that we see online, as I was saying, is much more on intent, much less on impact. And so unlike publishing, which is about divulging and making publicly known, criticism is much more than that. It's not just making publicly known, but criticism instead must have a purpose, and it must be useful in ways that it helps us interpret, it helps us denounce, it helps us translate. There is a kind of a layer of analysis and a layer of depth that comes in play. And so although story is inevitably dictated by the moment of its publication, what the Makoko floating school fate makes clear is the issue of distance. So in time, firstly, there's the lack of hindsight. So the school, we published it at the time where everyone else was publishing it. When it was new, it was completed, the photographs had been taken. It was at the time that publication was meant to happen. But it means that the formation of a critical response cannot develop that quickly, and will only happen kind of further down the line. So there is the risk of kind of publishing something that might prove to be not quite right, or a few months further down the line. But there's also an issue of distance in space, because this is a project that we could describe as being far away from London, at least. And that means that they can suffer from a lack of discernment, because the photographs, as you will have seen, were kind of very seductive, they were very convincing, there were the presence of people that seemed to show that it was real, that it was authentic. And the building at the time was visited by a writer who was commissioned by the AR, but he wasn't there on his own. There was a kind of very neatly choreographed press trip, we realized later on. And so that kind of fed into this media cycle, and the awards and publications around the world contributing to giving that project credibility. And the appearances were then maintained to preserve the school's reputation, and the stage photographs were relayed by the press beyond specialist titles, including a national newspaper. So oscillating between the question of space and the question of representation, architecture is increasingly reduced to images. A building, particularly in a 2D printed paper publication, a building becomes an image. It was Beatriz Colomina who said that the building should be understood in the same terms as drawings, photographs, writing, films, and advertisements, not only because they are the media in which more often we encounter it, but because the building is a mechanism of representation in its own right. The building is, after all, a construction in all senses of the world. And this is part of the idea that we were exploring in the book and Buildings for Book issue. So buildings can achieve a certain degree of permanence through the reproduction and proliferation of photographs, as if the images were gnawing at the reality. And yet the image is only ever a frozen moment in time. I always find it quite fascinating that in places like Dubai, the computer-generated images that precede the existence of new towers and artificial island, to the point that it doesn't really matter if they ever get built. No one actually knows whether those kind of aerial views turn out to actually have materialized. It's almost the renders that take over and become the reality. The point where they, if they do, sprung up from the ground and the land has actually been reclaimed almost loses significance. At that point, it's already, the project is already in our kind of common imaginary. And in Makoko, in a similar fashion, it was the image that kind of shrouded the school's existence. It's very hard after this attention, after these publications, to kind of review and publish or expose the truth or admit to what happened. As Steve Parnell, who's another of our contributors, wrote in the issue for the AR's 120th birthday, which was December 2016, December 2017, with this cover, the most common form of criticism in the history of the architectural press is to promote the good and ignore the bad, which is an approach he recognizes as being perhaps the most opaque and mysterious form of validation, because inevitably it is the result of choices, of editorial agendas, of personal subjectivities. As I was saying earlier, it depends on the taste of the editors, on their networks, on who they know, and especially not that long ago when editors were working before the internet, it was a completely different landscape to kind of find out what buildings were being completed where and when. In this infinite cyberspace, the selecting criteria are further dissolved by just the quantity that are uploaded and published on a daily, even hourly basis. And the lack of editorial agenda as such, I think, is at times deliberately blurred. But publishing, whether it's print or online, is never neutral or apolitical. I think this is something that I stand by. And furthermore, the degree of responsibility of a publication, I think, only rises with the upward curves of web traffic. So I think the platforms that have a large readership have a responsibility towards that readership. And as I say, I think the fact that publishing is never neutral or apolitical is very important. Now that we've looked at a little bit of the history of the AR, I want to kind of bring it a little bit more up to date and to show you how some of these questions have shaped the editorial line and agenda that we have as an editorial team today. So throughout the 126 years of history, the AR has gone back and forth between having thematic issues and non-thematic issues. And themes were most recently reintroduced in 2015, and we've kept them. So even at the times when the editorial agendas were driven by novelty and the magazine was publishing recently completed buildings, they often had monthly kind of dossier or themes, not necessarily the entire magazine, but a kind of a selection of articles and studies and reviews and on essays around a particular topic. And again, that depended on kind of the editors over time. These are our covers from 2020. I kind of wanted to take it back there because it takes us to just slightly before the pandemic. And I thought it was interesting to point out that the issue, which is the fourth one from the left on the first row, is actually the one we sent to press mid-March, on Friday the 13th of March, which was the last day we were all at the office. And it was about darkness, which turned out to be kind of weirdly prophetic. All the images inside are about empty parking lots and supermarkets and city streets at night, deserted. So it was very strange. What was, I guess, perhaps even more strange is that then we started working remotely, of course. And our next issue was about tourism. So it's the one with the Martin Parr photograph on the top right. And so we had already commissioned all except for one, actually, of the pieces for that issue. So they were all written, and there was no need to travel to visit the buildings, because obviously, as the Makoko story will probably have proven, we make sure we visit, and we are very careful into how we organize and who visits and how. And so we never publish a building study of a building that the writer hasn't visited. And so we had already commissioned all this content, and we found ourselves working from home, kind of atomized, not just even in the UK at the time, to edit a tourism issue, which was slightly surreal. And we were at home, all the planes were grounded, the cruise ships had become the stuff of nightmare, so that's, I guess, why we thought that Martin Parr photograph felt particularly, I don't know, it spoke to us. Even though it was an existing photograph, it felt like it was depicting some of what was going on. And the pandemic then forced us to adapt our editorial calendar. So, as I was saying, we couldn't visit buildings anymore, and we're interested in the life of buildings in use. Even if a writer lived next to a building we wanted to publish and it was possible to visit, if it was not in use, there was very little to write about and not as much of a story to tell. So we had to completely change the editorial calendar that we had in mind, and we turned instead to themes that we felt became pressing. So we looked at the interior world of our homes with the inside issue on the bottom left, the threats to architectural publication with the criticism issue. It's one of the ones I've got here. The manifestations of racial and colonial ideologies turning ground into property with the land issue, which is the penultimate one. The future of the profession with the letters to a young architect. And the need for housing to be recognized as a human right with the self-built housing issue, which is the last one on this page. So the themes each time, they're chosen and reduced to a single word, or almost single word, before being stretched again, pulled far and wide. And as an example, for example, the self-built housing issue is one that we called informal housing for a long time. And then as we were kind of commissioning, editing the publication, we realized that actually the kind of complexities of using a word such as informal, and so we renamed it quite late in the day before going to press self-built housing. So we have an initial idea that then gets kind of refined further down the line. The publication we very much see as a site for conversation. So when we did the criticism issue, it was actually the brief we gave to Laszlo Lantel, who was the artist who did the cover. It's actually one of those wraparound cover. You might notice that the publications are much thinner than the ones we did before the pandemic, because it was very difficult. We didn't know, we didn't have as much visibility on paper, just like the issues in the mid-40s were significantly thinner. And we didn't have any ads, so we had lots of wraparound covers, which is very fun editorially, but makes it much more difficult for a material magazine to survive. This is that issue. And as you might have seen from these few covers, the AR has a long tradition of eclectic, of provocative, of enigmatic covers, and almost famously, it rarely features actual buildings. Again, this is quite true of a lot of its archive, depending on the periods and the editors. Sometimes it was much more pro-buildings on the cover in the kind of slightly more commercial 90s, noughties especially. But otherwise, it remained kind of more of the AR's identity to not really feature buildings. And the reason we do that, or at least I don't know why editors at the time made those choices, but the reason we do that now and we avoid buildings on the cover is that we want to avoid the objectification of architecture. And instead, we want to show that our ambition is to broaden the conversation and to place architecture within a larger world and engage with ideas and conditions. This is 2021. And actually I realized because of the shift, because we're in November, the self-built housing issue I was talking about is actually the first one up there, rather than the last one of the previous spread is our December, January issue and July, August. So it was a monthly publication for most of its existence, and a few years ago we started doing 10 a year because of financial pressures, to summarize it. So in terms of, to continue just a little bit on the covers, so sometimes on the covers we repurpose existing images. So we have, for example, here for the tree issue, the penultimate one, it's a photograph by Yan Wang Preston. Or we repurpose artworks, like the one by Mimi Thompson for the underground issue, directly above the tree issue. Sometimes we commission original covers. So when we did a play issue, which is the pink one at the top, we commissioned Mulletman, an illustrator, to kind of design and draw a game. Once we made our own, which was the collage issue, which is the second one on the bottom row, as you might have noticed, where we had just done the waste issue, which had that Bertinsky shipyard shot on the cover. And so we were trying to find what cover to use for the collage issue, and we were kind of discussing the idea of how you make new things with things that are old. And so we thought we would do that with our own work and, yeah, just tear up the waste issue and to make something new out of it. We didn't ask Bertinsky for his thoughts on it, but loads of questions about licensing or copyright of images, etc. And since I chose to call this lecture Critical Thinking in Critical Times, I wanted to pause just for a little bit on that criticism issue, which, because it was quite early on in the pandemic when we started thinking about it, was also a lot about kind of like self-reflection on what a magazine is, what its purpose is in normal times, but also during the kind of extraordinary times of the lockdowns, etc. We felt it was important because there was such an explosion of conversation platforms to talk about the ways in which architecture is presented, the ways in which it's represented, communicated, disseminated, and consumed. And so we turned the gaze inwards to discuss the role of words, of sketches, of films, of awards, of buildings, of images, of collages, of references and paywalls in shaping architectural culture. We did this issue in 2020, as I was saying, at the beginning of that strange summer, and just a few weeks before the top of the second column of the New York Times front page read, Michael Sorkin, 71, New York City, champion of social justice through architecture. This was a newspaper dated 24 of May 2020, and the US had reached the grim milestone of 100,000 deaths in the coronavirus pandemic, and so the newspaper gave a small glimpse of the lives behind the numbers. The type is very small, the description is very short, but I thought the hierarchy of words here is actually very telling. It's social justice that comes before architecture, and there's also the choice of the adverb through, which is carrier of multiple meanings. It's architecture as a means to an end, and through evokes a process, something that is ongoing, almost moving. Sorkin was a fierce advocate of architectural criticism and a fervent defender of human rights. He was an architect as much as an activist, and he passionately fought for equity, for beauty, for sustainability. As a writer, which is almost the path of his career that I'm more interested in, he strove to unpack, to reveal, and to expose the truth about social relations rather than restrict himself to tectonic matters. He believed it was relevant for critics to discuss the income gap, the fate of the earth, urbanization, and its discontents through architecture. Architecture is only a small part of a much wider world, and yet, as I was saying earlier, the buildings that surround us and the buildings that we design reproduce and represent the world around them. They are the embodiment of power struggles, the expression of the political compromises and real estate forces that produce them, and the manifestation of rising ecological concerns. So at the AR, even if it has a broad definition of architecture, the conversation often starts with buildings. And the projects that we choose, as I was saying, because they're not the newest or the latest, instead they're chosen as prisms through which we can build arguments and broader narratives so that we can uncover the social, the political, and the ecological landscapes in which a project sits. We like to say that at the AR, or the AR, scours the globe for architecture that challenges and inspires, and explores the forces that shape the homes, cities, and places we inhabit. Buildings then become the vehicles of architectural criticism, and for them to gain relevance both within and outside architectural circles, they cannot be treated in isolation. They can be considered as objects, as the landscapes, or frozen images outside time. So the ambition of the AR is to publish stories that resonate beyond buildings' walls and extend outside architects' controls. In 2022, we looked at kitchens, animals, and this is in order from left to right, top to bottom, kitchens, animals, bodies, stone, transit, France. We used to do before the pandemic 2 issues a year that looked at a particular country or region. Again, this is something that we stopped during the pandemic, which we're looking to start again, even if complexities around travel mean we're still kind of in the process of reviewing those ideas. And after France, the black and white covers public space. Then we have education, energy, and the latest, which has just come out, is the AR emerging issue. Do you want some water, Tina? That's fine, I poured you one. So when we were I want to now look a little bit more at the education issue, which is the one with the Cedric Price drawing on the cover, and start by telling you a bit about what happens when we look for buildings for a theme like education. And so we started by thinking about the different sites for learning. So quite naturally, we started in the classroom. This is the Cherebota School in Cape Town, designed by Wolf Architects, which was reviewed by Huda Tayob. From the classroom, we moved to the city. This is the Hackney New Primary School in London by Henley Helbrand, which was only made possible because there was also the development of a lot of housing on the same site that funded the educational building and program. In Berlin, where it's a forgotten corner of Berlin, it's less city-like than the previous image. And this is the floating university that was born here. We found spaces for learning in the rainforest as well, with the indigenous university. On the beach in Chile, with Ciudad Abierta. And this is an example of what we call a revisit. And as I was saying, it's become more and more important to document, to interrogate, to revisit. And so we quite like to look back at buildings that have been completed a few years or sometimes a few decades ago, to reevaluate notable work, to measure whether the project succeeded and what lessons can be drawn from it today. So sometimes it's kind of well-known, let's say, project like a Habitat 67 or the Évora project by Álvaro Siza come to mind, and sometimes they're lesser known, and sometimes we realize that actually it doesn't take all that long for lessons to be learned from a project. I'm thinking of a project by Viglieca in the outskirts of São Paulo, for example, which was housing for a very deprived community, and within 3 years, there was quite a lot to tell. So this was one we published in 2015. In 2012, the project was completed. Again, the intentions were brilliant. They had kind of rehoused some of the inhabitants who were more at risk of landslide on the particular terrain, and so they were rehousing them in a kind of large housing block with communal facilities that were to serve these residents as well as their neighbors, so the wider community. It included things like a bridge that connected the two sides of the valley for children to go to school, etc. And just within 3 years, it proved that actually a lot of it wasn't working. And this was one instance I remember of it being very useful to just not only see the building, speak to the inhabitants, to commission new photography, so the same photographer who'd taken the shots in 2012 went back, and to do a film as well where we could kind of interview the caretaker of the block, some of the residents, some of the neighbors, but also go back to Héctor Viglieca's office and show him this and ask him for his thoughts. And I thought this was, following on from the floating school in Makoko's story, it's a sense of how can we work and what role the press can play so we can actually learn lessons from the project. And the idea behind the AR education issue was also to look critically at architectural education, not just as buildings that are for education or learning or teaching spaces. So this is a sense, it's a bit small perhaps, this is a sense of the contents page just to give you an idea of the mix of pieces, of building studies, of essays, of case studies, photo essays, pieces about the crit. And this table of contents in the magazine is immediately followed up by the keynote essay, which was written by Marie-Louise Richards, in which she argues that architectural education has the potential to transform and reimagine the structures of oppression that its institutions embody. And she asks what kind of education could be imagined if it were centered on care and effective labor. So as architecture schools around the world are looking to decolonize and decarbonize their curricula, when we were preparing the issue, we wanted to hold onto bell hooks' belief that teaching should enable transgressions, which I think is a brilliant quote. Bell Hooks was an American author and activist, not widely known in architectural circles, but she defended the idea that education as the practice of freedom, which felt very critical to the issue. And so we chose her as the subject of reputations. I think there's a page missing. Is there a page missing? Sorry. Yes, this one. And in this piece, the author, Charles Davis, explains that because she saw architecture as a cultural practice with a political function, bell hooks taught us to look at Black vernacular forms and challenge canonical histories. So by adopting a thematic approach, rather than being monographic, looking at a particular practice, or driven by novelty, we're coming at the AR at architecture from a slight tangent, preferring those filters, as Tina was saying, of whether they are darkness, tourism, gardens, play, waste, light, animals, energy, education, to drive editorial research and to influence the selection of buildings and arguments we publish. And rather than disseminating outwards, the role of the AR is to digest a deluge of information and to filter, critically filter, curate and edit, carefully framing and telling the story that press release shared instantly don't. And since it's easy to neglect what has been neglected elsewhere, it's also part of the AR's role to identify, research, and uncover projects and practices that are in the margins, and to make space for those outside the field that have much to teach us. Bell hooks, I think, being one of those examples. And when we tackle these wider issues, to kind of go back a little bit to Sorkin, we turn architecture into a medium. So with buildings and with ideas, we can build arguments. And they're another architecture. They're produced with words, with drawings, with photographs, on what we would call, following on from Colomina, the immaterial sites that are architectural publications, responding to rather than replicating what happens on the building site. As Tina was saying, and as I hope I've shown, buildings are built on site, but architecture is built in the discourse. So I hope, this is just back to the covers of this year, I've given you a sense of what critical thinking is, of how it translates into a magazine, and why it's important for architecture. And I hope I'd love the idea to kind of discuss some of these things. I wanted to put a lot of things in front of your eyes, some of the kind of opening pages, the education issues, some of the themes, so that we can discuss further. And before we do that, I also, and this is part of my job, I think, to tell you or to remind you that reading the AR and sharing a newsletter, buying an issue, or becoming a subscriber are all ways in which you can support architectural criticism. The critical times I was referring to in the title are also making it difficult for the press and printed publications especially to survive. So if you'd like to read and support the AR, there's 25% off on the shop if you want to get any back issues, and 50% on student subscriptions if you'd like. And that's all from me before the questions and conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manon, for this presentation. Maybe we should just start, since we are in the premises of architectural education. If you could share some thoughts of, I know that this was one of the issues, and I think in 2012, you had another issue on the pedagogies and education. And of course, through the letters of the young architects, which were part of the pandemic season, you somehow learned or you got an insight from the community, which is maybe here today. So how do you see the challenges that we would need to address now within the decarbonizing and decolonizing our curriculums, and what are these kind of instant measures that we could address as educational institution, but also what is the long-term progress? So how do you see it from the being not part of it as we all are, but from outside?
It's a big question. It's certainly one that we were interested in exploring. I think it plays at different scales. I think one is firstly what we can go on to do, having studied architecture, because I think the idea that we don't go to architecture school only to build buildings at the end of it, I think is something that resonates with me, because I went to architecture school. Most of the team, the editorial team, are trained architects as well. The editors, not all of them. There's one who's an art historian, and there's a graphic designer, but otherwise there is a lot of kind of architectural training, and I think it's hard to imagine that we could do what we do without architectural training. And so I think firstly to kind of widen the possibilities of what architecture education can be used for is quite interesting, and perhaps something that could be made more explicit during education. I think the way we practice then as architects, we sometimes ask ourselves, if we were going to, in a magazine, publish new buildings, but living in a world where actually we maybe shouldn't be building as many new buildings, what is the kind of content of an architecture magazine? And this applies equally to the profession at large. What role do architects play in a world that we, or at least in certain parts of this world, where we shouldn't be building half as much as we're building? And so the idea to choose to not build, to find other solutions, to, of course, reuse and transform existing structures are all much more critical. And I think that's already had started to happen, that I think that's much more part of the programs than it was not that long ago. I think there's, I'm not familiar with the context in Vienna and Austria, but I think there's also certainly in the UK difficulties with the kind of forces that are above architectural institutions and universities at large. And the kind of, the university having become such a kind of neoliberal institution makes it very difficult to ensure that what happens inside is not affected by the wider forces at play. I remember having a conversation that we published in the November issue last year with Leslie Loco and Francesca Hughes, when they were talking about the future of architectural education, and they were saying that an architecture school is somewhere where you can kind of safely take risks, which I thought was quite a beautiful description, actually, of it. It probably is true of other types of education. But so it makes us think, I think, of the roles that different people play in those institutions and in their structures to guarantee that that remains the case. That's the start of maybe something more will come. Or as we
sure. I would like to ask everyone to somehow participate in this discourse or discussion, as this was the basically the introduction to the further discussion. So are there any questions, maybe? Artem?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the lecture. I will try to ask a question. It's very difficult to ask architectural question from editor of architectural magazine, because you anyway know things much better. So, but I will try. And I think it was very interesting how you also highlighted that now with the digital media, you every time kind of a bit behind the deadlines of being really like fresh announcements of new projects. And this section of revisiting, kind of rediscovering architecture, but also learning mistakes, which I think is somehow not really present enough in professional discourse, like really learn what we did wrong or like why these things don't work. But we still, to understand why things don't work, we often first got to build, and then we see like why it was a mistake, why it was a fail. At the critical conditions where we are now, probably we don't have such a possibility anymore to build and test anything in real scale. So I would like to ask you if you have in mind, or if you like any idea or strategy how we could avoid these mistakes getting built, and how we can test to discuss ideas before they actually consume so much resources and energy. Thank you.
I mean, I think learning from what has been built is the first step, because I think, and this is why the idea of revisit, but even, you know, the example of Makoko, this is why I wanted to really insist on it, because I think it can actually be so damaging, because it can perpetrate an idea that this school is changing the world for the better. And I think I think if we did more revisits, if we did more kind of studies further down the line on the impact that buildings have had, and if we were in a way perhaps also more honest about our heroes and about the kind of landmark projects, and it would be, we would probably be in a better place. One of the first issues I did as editor was about the theme of failure, and it was exactly about that. It was about saying that actually we sell architecture and architectural history as a kind of catalogue of success stories, you know, of brilliant buildings, and we don't ever go back to think about whether that still remains valid. I remember the cover on that issue, we put Farnsworth House. You know, it was the idea that it was, I don't have an image of it here, but it was this shot that, it was always a test question at the time, like, it's like, do people actually recognize the building? Because it was a shot for when it had flooded, obviously it wasn't supposed to flood. And it was this kind of cropped shot. And so it's the views that you never see. And I think this is where the power that media and images have can't be understated. Because they're the images that kind of shape our imaginary, that become kind of the references that we go on to build new projects from. I think whether we work as practitioners, I guess, I mean, I still consider myself an architect. Whether we work with words, with images, with materials, we're always kind of collaging and reusing others' ideas and moving things and references. And so I think having a more honest account of those precedents and of that history, and challenging the architectural history that has kind of shaped, or well, the Western canon particularly, that has shaped kind of architectural history, would also be hugely beneficial. Because I think otherwise a lot of the foundations are misguided. So I think that's probably, and I don't know, sometimes I wonder, like, we need to know about new buildings that are completed, but I sometimes do wonder the role, how that helps the profession to kind of, yes, we can see on our screens, etc., but, you know, a building that was completed and the pictures, and we can learn there, like, on a perhaps more technical side, or kind of new with, like, I don't know, new experimental ways to deal with materials. You know, there's things that can be learned at the point of completion. I'm not saying there aren't any, but I'm not sure those news serve as much of a purpose. And what I find slightly perhaps harder to admit is that to go back to the Makoko example, that investigative journalist who published that account in 2016, 18, 2 years after the Biennale, you know, it was months and months and months of investigation. So, and this is something that also needs to be funded, you know, and who is actually funding that? It's a really important question, I think.
Christian Kuhn.
Thank you. I have two connected questions. The first is, can you imagine to go completely online with AR? And the second is, if you started from scratch, which way would you go?
Which way would it go?
If you started from scratch, would you go digital or in print?
I will walk slowly.
Going digital is something that has been thought about not by me or previous editors, but by the owners of the publication, and that was nearly going to happen a few years ago. It was, I don't know, in 2016 maybe, 2015, around that time. When the news came out that both the AR and the AJ, so the sister title, the UK title, were going to go online, was spread. The was, of course, the first platform to jump on the fact that those publications were going to go online. It didn't turn out to be true. It was something the person at the top of the company at the time had said. They wanted to get rid of print, so they then went on to sell all the titles and were now owned by another quite similar corporation, but it's no longer on the agenda as such. Personally, I still feel that it would kill the AR if it went online. I think it's not just that kind of photograph of Alistair Ruth, you know, the retired architect and his piles and piles of magazine. I think that architects are still attached to print. I say that because that's what I feel, but also we have, so the Architectural Review is part of a publishing house called EMAP, based in London, and they own a lot of titles. Most of them are not architecture, and most of them are kind of standard trade publications, which is why I was hinting to the fact that our owners kind of don't quite know how to handle this one, how to market it, or how to make it make money, because they can't apply the same formulas that they do with other more standard UK-focused and only UK-based titles. But we're by far the publication in the company that has the smallest number of digital-only subscribers. So it is possible today to subscribe to the AR digital-only, but that number went up a little bit during the pandemic, but it remains very low. So the huge majority of readers want to receive the print publication. Having said that, I think it's also really important to use what the digital world kind of can offer that we can't do in print. And I think the, you know, just the simple fact that we have infinite space online is a huge advantage, and something that is obviously not the case in a printed publication. And I think the AR could do a lot more online and could do, you know, we've done a few podcasts, a few videos, things like that. I think there's a lot more that could be done. I think what I find interesting online is that you can extend the conversation kind of outside and beyond the printed pages. You can also start to connect the dots between what, you know, is being said today, or like in October 22, as to what was being said 6 months, 6 years, 60 years ago. And I think connecting those things is what actually becomes interesting, and that's something that can happen in the digital space that doesn't really belong in print as much. And if the AR were to start now, what would it be? I mean, I do think Dezeen is a very different platform, but it's an incredible success story of a platform or publication. I still struggle calling them a magazine, even though they call themselves a magazine. You know, that was started much more recently, and I think it's very clever in understanding the world we live in and making the most of it. It's not necessarily something I'm as interested in terms of an editorial agenda, and, you know, I was talking about editorial responsibility. Now I think that there are a lot of smaller, younger publications that are starting out. I know, or that have started out in more recent years. I know it's difficult for many reasons. The price of paper has gone through the roof in the last few years, especially. It's very costly. It's very difficult. So that remains a question. The one thing I think I do sometimes envy of publications that don't have the same history is that they don't have kind of that weight in a way. And I think that can be quite liberating as well. And I think with the AR, what's interesting is to kind of, you know, we're kind of the caretakers of this thing that has been alive for over 125 years, and so we have to kind of evolve it. I think it's also like there's a duty of care with like kind of looking after a title like this, and a responsibility that comes with it, to understand and respond to like our own history, not to become self-referential, but to be critical about the AR's own history, I think is kind of part of the work that has to be done as the years kind of go by. I hope I've answered your question.
Hello, thank you for such a wonderful talk. I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about readership, and if it's just something that when you're writing or when you're commissioning writers, if you're thinking about who your reader is or who they are, and how that informs the present and the future of the publication.
The one good thing about digital readership or digital stats is that we do have a lot more information now than we would have had in the past when this thing is in the post and that's it. It's interesting because actually the question of readership, it remains an architectural title, almost, you know, our motto is not by architects for architects at all, but it still remains a little bit of that, and I'm aware of that. But we're very interested in widening that readership. Part of the idea is to make the case and show that actually architecture should be relevant beyond kind of architectural circles. And that is the point that we kind of try to make. And I think that's one of the reasons why, as editor as well, like I kept the themes, the idea of having thematic issues, that was reintroduced by Christine Murray, my predecessor. And I was saying that it was a response to kind of the novelty agenda, like to kind of not do that. But I think it's also a way to hopefully kind of reach out and attract an audience that isn't of architects. Because the themes that we choose are kind of purposely kind of not as architectural as kind of some other architecture magazine themes, or even some themes that the AR itself had earlier on, which it was more about like, you know, or building types, or like you know, you had an issue on workplaces, and you had an issue on like vernacular architecture, and you had an issue on adaptive reuse at the very beginning of it. And so we tried to move away to kind of challenge that as well. And what has meant is also that we get people who kind of get a one-off issue because they're interested in that theme. And so they don't, yes, it's the architectural review, but it will be the tourism issue or the animals issue. And so I think it's also through those themes that we're kind of looking to widen that readership. And I feel like it's almost one of the nicest compliments is when someone who isn't an architect emails, you know, to tell us how much they've enjoyed an issue. And so, and I'm saying this being conscious that it remains, our readership is still mostly architects, but architects in a broad sense. There's a lot of kind of people who might have been trained as architects but are not kind of practicing architects. So it is again like a broader definition, educators in particular, students as well. And yeah, I think it's almost one of the nicest compliments when someone says, you know, that they've enjoyed an issue. And so, yes, of course, there are kind of detailed drawings and they're kind of like more technical pieces in the magazine, but we spend a lot of time editing the text in those pieces as well, so that they speak to an audience that's much wider than kind of a smaller architectural circles. I think we are also very aware of architectural jargon, which isn't, I think, a taboo, really, and so we really try to kind of get rid of that and to make sure that the pieces are accessible and readable by people who don't necessarily have as much architectural training, and that's to cater both for, you know, students in first years of architecture as well as people who are outside the profession. It also is really important to us to commission a lot of pieces and invite people to contribute who aren't architects or who aren't even architectural writers or critics, but to invite geographers and to invite people in anthropology and to invite people in kind of in engineering as well, people in kind of very different fields to contribute to the magazine, to kind of give them a voice, and again to kind of widen that discourse and the perspectives from which we write. And then in the question of readership, I think there's also something about geography, and this is something that we're currently working on because it was particularly during the pandemic and with the Black Lives Matter movement that we became more and more aware of like the homogeneity of our team. We're a very small team, we're all based in London. And we've been asking ourselves how we can kind of widen those perspectives, and so we've started putting in place a framework of editorial contributors, and so we organize workshops with people we invite, and they invite other people to contribute, and so this is a kind of a work in progress, but I think it's a response as well to how and perhaps mainly by whom architectural criticism is made or written, which I think again goes back to your question, is this kind of difficult bit perhaps of the AR's history, you know, who was writing architectural criticism over the years, and it was very often male firstly. I mean, I'm the third editor who's female, and I'm the 16th editor in 100 and so we've been 3 in a row, you know, so they've just been kind of catching up because they realized. But even in the pages in Who Writes, it was a lot of regular writers as well, so people who were mostly, well, there was a large proportion of kind of British writers and who wrote about buildings in other countries because they were traveling there or because they were going to see them. And so we're much more interested now in commissioning local voices, in commissioning new writers, and not relying as much on a smaller circle of voices to kind of widen the perspectives. And I think the voices of people you include in the magazine has a kind of, there's a direct relationship with, therefore, the kind of the readership and the people you're going to interest and, you know, be relevant to as a title.
Someone else? I would have an extent of a question because you mentioned a little bit this already now. So could you maybe answer a little bit more personal but also objective from the perspective of how do you see the criticism could be thought? You mentioned the workshops now. And what's the role of the architectural education? Did, in your case, your architectural education prepare you for the role you were in? And how are you seeing your colleagues that you are, you know, contributing writers, your team members, how did they, certain architectural education shape them? Mm-hmm. And how would you challenge the current states? Of course, we have a landscape of different schools, a landscape of different approaches, but could you just somehow point out certain specificities that you maybe were able to observe?
I think perhaps one of the most useful thing I was told in architecture school was, you know, when you're working on a project, to put all the drawings and the models to the side, take a blank sheet of paper and just write down in 3 sentences what the project is in half a page, like, so 3 sentences, 1 paragraph and 3 paragraphs, you know, like, and I think that's actually so critical, and I think it was quite late, I think it was my 4th year, so it took a while, but I felt it was so important to play with the different kind of sides of the brain, I guess, and to kind of, to think and design by making, but also to use words as a design tool. And I think that forces us to kind of look at design projects in a different way when we have to articulate them, to present them, when we have to, you know, build an argument or present an idea, and when we don't rely as much on the drawings and the models. Obviously they, you know, work together, but I think the idea of pushing them to the side and looking at them, and then having, you know, to accept the difficulty of, well, I really like this model, but actually it's not relevant, or it's not making the point I want to make, or it's going in the wrong direction, and to make those critical choices along the way, I think, are part of how you build a project. And I think, I mean, I studied at the AA, I worked in practice in Colombia, so my references are kind of quite specific to those, to the AA, to London, and to Medellin in that case. But I think I wish there was a little bit more of that. I think even to, you know, even if it is to go and design buildings, I think that that's part of a process that would benefit the design process at large. Something that occurred to me when you were asking the question as well, in terms of the tools and like what we learn and like where criticism is going, I also wonder if, like, you know, speaking about print or even print versus digital remains like quite a kind of an obvious kind of debate, I guess. But I feel there is something really great as well about like sound and about films and about moving images, because we often find ourselves writing about buildings on the other side of the world. And, you know, sure, the writer has been and visited or might live there, but we are editing these pieces as editors we might not have been, and we're also working to towards like publication of these pieces to present them in front of an audience who has not and might never go to Lima or to Kyoto. And I think it was a project in Lima actually. It was that Grafton University building. I remember seeing the projects the pictures when we published it, and it was Iwan Ban again who had gone and taken the shots, and he included like some sound, like recordings from his iPhone. And it was only when I heard that I understood the traffic and the street and like actually felt the city around it. And then I realized that actually, you know, I don't want to kind of dispute what I've just said about print and the value of print, but like I think there's a lot that you kind of can't do through just kind of 2D printed matter. And so I think the idea of doing like even just audio, like films is a step almost further, and it's kind of the inhabitation, and it goes back to that revisit I was talking about in Sao Paulo. But even just sound, I think it's something we forget about, like whether as architects or as editors, I guess. And I don't know, I wonder if the different tools that we use and the different kind of skills that we develop, which again, I think is something that, you know, I'm not here suggesting that this is, you know, the way forward or anything. Is definitely something that is happening, but I think it's quite relevant actually to architectural education and to architectural criticism, which is often presented with words, drawings, photographs. They're kind of the three base mediums, I guess, that are used. You know, the photographs including kind of real photographs and photographs of model, etc. But they remain kind of, they're much more silent, I think. I think there was one more point in your question that I haven't addressed, but I can't remember what it is.
I think it was, yeah, I'm going to pose the last question, I guess. So you referred to the critical position through the projects, and of course critical position through the, let's say, texts. So through any action which we are doing, we could be also activists, we can have a political stand, and then we are more and more aware of all those options that we have. So maybe just to touch on your last issue. So what would be your comment, because we have a lot of maybe emerging architects in our audience, or they are going to become emerging architects, or those that they are almost not emerging anymore. But how do you see the landscape of today's emerging architects, and how do you see this is different to, I don't know, 10 years ago when you were seeking for the new voices that became star architects in this moment?
So the issue, the last one here, which is back from the printers, but in London. So it is about emerging architecture. We've also included letters from a young architect after having done our letters to a young architect during the pandemic. And the emerging architecture is, the program that we do is something that was created by Peter Davey, who was the editor from 1980 to 2005, I think. Second longest serving editor, 25 years, good run. And one of the few who decided to leave and was not forced to leave. He just retired and had done. And so he created this program in 1999 called Emerging Architecture, which was an awards program, and it was in response to all the Pritzker prizes and gold medals that were awarded to architects. And his idea was that, well, it's no point giving an architect a prize when they're done or nearly done with their career. The work we need to recognize and encourage, and the people we need to help are younger architects. So again, I don't believe it was the very first, but it was one of the first programs to kind of recognize and celebrate the kind of talent of the next generation. And I think it's now become kind of an awards program that we do. Awards are a whole other kind of aspect of architectural publication and the questions of funding, but without going there, I think what's interesting is to see how that has actually evolved, like since, so over 20 years now. We do it every year, and so we have architects from around the world sending us their work, and we make a selection, and then a jury picks a winner. Quite kind of straightforward as a process. And it remained kind of largely unchanged, actually, as a process. So it was architects, there was one criteria, emerging architects had to be under the age of 45. That has remained the case. We've kind of haven't changed that age. And the idea, at the beginning, it was that architects would submit one project, so 2 boards, and the projects were kind of judged on these boards, and there was a winner kind of selected based on that one project. And in a few years ago now, in 2016, we started saying, well, actually, we don't want it to be just one project because we don't feel that's indicative of a practice or a direction of travel, and we can't kind of trust the one project. Like the point of looking at kind of the younger generation and the next generation of architects is to understand where they're going to go and where they're interested in going and what they're interested in pursuing. And so we started asking architects to send us 3 projects, one completed project because we still feel it's something we're maybe debating a bit more now, but that built work had to still be like a key kind of cornerstone. So it could be a small extension, it could be like a pavilion, it doesn't have to be huge, but there needed to be one built structure. The second project we asked them to share with us is a work in progress, which can be something that is on site or on the drawing board. And the third project we just call an idea, which can be anything from an exhibition, a chair, an essay, a film, anything at all. And it's interesting already to see how, I think, the different forms, the different forms of practice. I don't think it's because we've, made these the rules of the game that we've, that architects are working in this way. I think it was also a response to how architects are working. And we've also noticed that it's important for us because we kind of ensure that the architects that we publish and select are, we kind of, more sure of where they want to go, of what they're interested in and what they might be doing later on. Sorry. Something that is happening more recently and which we look at in this issue is different kind of setups and forms of practice, in the sense that I think we're aware that the kind of age of this architect is kind of long gone. There's an interesting, probably, moment now where a lot of famous international architecture practices that were built and were named after the founders and are going to having to pass on to the next generation. Rogers being kind of one obvious example, how the name is kind of gradually evolving. A practice like Herzog and de Meuron is asking themselves that. So there is this happening, and at the same time, we find a lot more architects who, as younger architects who we're publishing, who are emerging and developing other ways of working. So they're not necessarily kind of founding a practice and kind of that's it. They're working more collaboratively and more collectively and with different types of people on different projects. So I don't know, it seems like it's also a way to kind of perhaps have like more agency, to maybe not have the same idea of kind of building a practice, but being kind of more nimble and collaborating on different projects with different people. And so this idea of kind of collective and collaborative practice is something that we are seeing a lot more of, which, on a kind of practical level, it means like even for the emerging architecture program, it means that now we kind of, we're happy to find out or publish people who, even though they have one practice, they also work on another practice with other things, but they're also working on this collective. And so the body of work is much more of a constellation than a kind of a rigid framework. And I think there's something interesting in breaking down the kind of rigidity of the kind of practice setup as we might have known it.
I think it's a very good conclusion for all the emerging architects, and somehow to reflect on the possibilities of your paths in the future, and of course for those that you're already working in such constellations. So thank you so much, Manon, for this talk, and it was a brilliant evening. Thank you.